Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. And today we're diving into one of the most disturbing and controversial cases in criminal history. A case that raises questions about justice, mental illness, and how sometimes the system fails in ways that seem almost impossible to believe. This is the story of Issei Sagawa, a crime that shocked the world and a legal outcome that still baffles people decades later. So let's go back to Paris, 1981. The City of Light, right? Romance, art, the Eiffel Tower. But in June of that year, something absolutely horrific was unfolding in a small apartment. Our story centers on two people, Issei Sagawa, a Japanese graduate student at the Sorbonne, and Renée Hartevelt, a beautiful, intelligent Dutch woman who was also studying at the prestigious university. They knew each other as classmates. They'd studied together. By all accounts, Renée was kind to Sagawa, friendly even. She had no idea what was going through his mind. Sagawa was a small man, barely 5 feet tall, and he'd grown up in Japan feeling deeply insecure about his appearance and stature. But there was something else going on in his head. Dark, obsessive thoughts that had apparently plagued him since childhood. He later claimed he'd been fantasizing about cannibalism since he was a young boy. Yes, you heard that right. He described having an overwhelming desire to consume a beautiful Western woman, to literally make her a part of him. It's disturbing to even talk about, but understanding the psychology here is crucial to grasping how this all unfolded. On June 11th, 1981, Sagawa invited Renée to his apartment. The pretext was innocent enough. He asked her to help him with a translation project to read some German poetry that he was working on. She agreed. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? They were friends, or so she thought. When she arrived at his apartment that evening, she had no reason to suspect anything was wrong, but Sagawa had planned everything meticulously. While Renée sat at his desk, reading the poetry aloud in her gentle voice, Sagawa retrieved a rifle from where he'd hidden it. And then, without warning, without mercy, he shot her in the back of the head. She died instantly. Just like that, a young woman full of life and potential was gone, murdered by someone she'd shown nothing but kindness to. Now, here's where this gets even more disturbing. What happened next wasn't a panic, wasn't an accident spiraling out of control. Sagawa did exactly what he'd planned to do. Over the next 2 days, he engaged in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He photographed her body from various angles, recorded himself on tape, and consumed parts of her flesh, raw and cooked. He later described trying different parts of her body, which ones tasted better, as if he were some kind of grotesque food critic. The level of premeditation and the calculated nature of what he did is absolutely chilling. After 2 days, reality started to set in. He had to dispose of the evidence. Sagawa dismembered Renée's body, packed the parts into 2 suitcases, and took a taxi to the Bois de Boulogne, a large park on the edge of Paris. His plan was to dump the suitcases in a pond and walk away. But here's where his careful planning fell apart. People saw him. He looked suspicious, struggling with these heavy suitcases, acting nervous. When he thought no one was looking, he abandoned the suitcases and fled. It didn't take long for someone to investigate these abandoned suitcases by the pond. When they were opened, the discovery was nightmarish. The police were called immediately, and the evidence quickly led them to Sagawa. He was arrested within days. When questioned, he confessed almost immediately. He didn't just confess. He went into disturbing detail about what he'd done and why. He told investigators about his lifelong fantasies, about his obsession with Renée, about everything. Now, you'd think this is where justice kicks in, right? Open and shut case, confession, evidence, motive. But this is where the story takes a turn that makes people's jaws drop even today. Sagawa was charged with murder, but French authorities ordered him to undergo psychiatric evaluation. The psychiatrists who examined him determined that he was legally insane and unfit to stand trial. He was committed to a psychiatric hospital in France, locked away in a mental institution rather than a prison. For a couple of years, Sagawa remained in French psychiatric care. But then, in 1984, the French authorities made a decision that would have enormous consequences. They decided to deport him to Japan. The idea was that he would continue his psychiatric treatment in his home country. His wealthy father pulled strings, hired lawyers, and worked to get his son transferred to a Japanese mental institution. And this is where the system completely broke down in a way that seems almost unbelievable. When Sagawa arrived in Japan, there was a massive problem with the transfer of legal documents and psychiatric records. The French government had sealed Sagawa's case files, and Japanese authorities claimed they never received the proper documentation they needed to continue his prosecution or even his detention. Japanese psychologists examined him and determined that he was sane, completely contradicting the French evaluation. But here's the kicker. Without the proper paperwork from France, Japanese authorities said they couldn't hold him or charge him with a crime that had occurred in another country. So in 1986, just 5 years after he murdered and cannibalized Renée Hartevelt, Issei Sagawa walked out of a Tokyo psychiatric hospital a free man. No trial, no prison sentence, nothing. The Japanese legal system essentially threw up its hands and said they couldn't do anything. Renée's family was devastated, the public was outraged, but there he was, free. And here's where this story becomes even more surreal and disturbing. Instead of living in shame or hiding from society, Sagawa became something of a celebrity in Japan. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. He wrote books about his crime, gave interviews, appeared on talk shows. He wrote a novel called In the Fog that detailed his crime. He became a restaurant critic, which is darkly ironic given what he'd done. He appeared in pornographic films and art house projects. There were manga and artwork inspired by his story. The Japanese media, at least segments of it, seemed fascinated by him rather than repulsed. Some people tried to rationalize this bizarre celebrity by saying, Japanese culture has different attitudes about crime and rehabilitation, or that there was artistic interest in the psychological aspects of his case. But let's be clear, this wasn't about rehabilitation. Sagawa has never shown genuine remorse. In interviews over the years, he's talked about his crime in ways that suggest he'd do it again if he could get away with it. He's described still having the same urges, the same fantasies. He's expressed regret not for what he did, but for getting caught. For decades, Sagawa lived a relatively normal life in Tokyo. He gave paid interviews to journalists from around the world. He appeared in documentaries. Every time he spoke publicly, it reopened the wounds for Renée's family, who had to watch this man profit from their daughter's brutal murder. There were attempts by some Japanese publications to stop giving him a platform, and over the years, as public sentiment shifted, he did become more of a pariah. But the damage was done. It wasn't until he became elderly and his health began failing that Sagawa finally faded from public view. His brother, who had been supporting him financially, cut him off at some point, reportedly disgusted by Issei's lack of remorse. In recent years, Sagawa has lived in relative poverty and obscurity, suffering from diabetes and other health conditions. Some reports suggest he had a stroke, but he's still alive, still free, never having spent a single day in prison for murdering Renée Hartevelt. So, what do we take away from this absolutely maddening case? First, it exposes serious flaws in international legal cooperation. The breakdown between French and Japanese authorities meant that a confessed killer simply slipped through the cracks. Second, it raises uncomfortable questions about how we treat mental illness in the criminal justice system. Was Sagawa truly insane? The experts couldn't even agree. And if someone commits a horrific crime while mentally ill, at what point do we say they're cured enough to be released? But perhaps most importantly, this case forces us to confront how society responds to violent criminals. The fact that Sagawa was able to become a minor celebrity, to profit from his crime, to live freely while showing no remorse, it's a slap in the face to victims' families everywhere. Renée Hartevelt was a real person with a real family who loved her. She was talented, kind, and had her whole life ahead of her. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just as the victim of a monster who later became famous for killing her. The Issei Sagawa case remains one of the most troubling examples of justice denied. It's a reminder that sometimes the systems we create to protect society and punish wrongdoing can fail spectacularly. And it's a story that, however much we might wish otherwise, we need to remember and learn from. Because cases like this show us exactly what can go wrong when bureaucracy, politics, and loopholes in the law allow evil to walk free. That's the story of Issei Sagawa. Disturbing, enraging, and unfortunately, completely true.